Chapter 8. The Franklins from outside were lodged at farms up and down the parish, and lay there during the Feast of Yule. In most places they were well received. The Realmrakings had a good mind to march upon Oslo and give Duke Eirik a taste of their steel. But Sire Halbjorn was invited to stay at Suderheim. He was distantly related to John Raud, and so the latter asked Olav Audunsson also to be his guest during Yule. He occupied the manor with his youngest son, Ivar. The two others, Haftor, the king's son-in-law, and Tor, speaker of the Thing, were with the king at Bjornvin. Sire Halbjorn and Olaf were assigned a bed in a fine house apart, where the two unmarried sons lived, and John had suitable clothes sent out to them. Not for years had Olaf kept Yule with so cheerful a heart. Messengers left the manor and came home with news. John had his scouts abroad. The king's young kinsman, Munin Bardson at Akershus, had received tidings of the raid in good time. The castle was undermanned, so he could not venture a sally, but he had beaten off the first attack. After that, the Duke sat down before the castle, but the long-continued rain forced him to break camp in the swampy ground about Aker and retire upon the town of Oslo. There he kept Yule in the old royal palace on the river bank, dubbed his Norwegian friends knights, and held a tournament, although it was said he had gotten an ague in the camp, so that he was often sick. He exacted a ransom from the country districts, nor did the townsmen go free, though he dealt somewhat more gently with them. The folk at Suderheim laughed rather maliciously when they heard of it, for there had been no bounds to the affection the men of Oslo showed Duke Eirik before, when he visited the town as King Haakon's son-in-law-to-be. The Duke's army numbered 300 German horsemen, 150 Swedish men-at-arms, and his Norwegian adherents had among them a little over an old 100 of men, most of them armed after the fashion of squires. John Raud of Suderheim was not so very old, but he was in bad health, so it fell upon his son Ivar Johnson to lead the country levies, and he was courageous, prudent, and well liked by the people. But he was very young, just 21. They kept their Yule feast at Suderheim as usual, and here Olaf met several men and women with whom he could claim distant kinship, going back to the time when his forefathers were in possession of Dyffryn. He was also related to the men of Suderheim, it turned out. "How can it be, Olaf," asked John one day, "that you have never cared to serve the king? It is not right that a man of such good birth, substance, and courtly breeding should have no place among his bodyguard." "I have served King Haakon when he called out the levies," replied Olaf. "But you must know, sir, I was Alf Erlingsson's liegeman in my youth, and I swore by God and by my patron saint, when I heard the Earl had died in banishment, that never would I swear any other allegiance on the hilt of my sword, and least of all to the man who made him an outlaw." "Well, then you are more loyal than most men," said John with a little sigh. He himself had known the Earl well, and after this he often talked with Olaf of the gentle Lord Alf. And Olaf felt he had not been drawn so near to his own youth and the time when he was free and light of heart. Ah, yes, not since he came home to Norway. Sire Halbjorn was, too, like another man, a sociable and kindly companion. He was in the war heart and soul, and took part in all the Suderheim men's plans. It was clearly far easier for him to mix with worldly lords and knights than with priests and countrymen. Sometimes he and Olaf went hunting with young Ivar and his friends when the weather suited. On the holy days he said Mass in the church, to the great joy of the people, for he carried himself nobly at the altar, and had a clear and powerful voice, whether in speaking or singing. But the parish priest here was a bungler, and John's chaplain was so old that he was in his second childhood. He could still say Mass, but he no longer knew people rightly. He often took Ivar to be John, who had been his foster son in his youth. Hafthor's young wife, Lady Agnes Håkonsdatter, was at home at Suderheim, as she was expecting her second child. There was already a son, and no doubt his kinsfolk had their plans for that boy, should the little Lady Ingeborg die without heirs. What Olav had heard of the lady's mother, King Hakon's leman, had always moved him strangely, although most folk made a scornful jest of her. She was a yeoman's daughter from the fjords, and she had been Queen Ingeborg's bathhouse maid. One day, when she had made the bath too hot, her mistress had struck her so fiercely that she left the bathhouse bleeding and in tears, and there she was met by the king's young son, Duke Hakon. He spoke to the maid and asked why she was weeping so. Fair to look on she was not, and she was much older than he, by a score of years at least. But before the year was out, she had a child by the king's son. The queen was sore displeased, but the duke would not part from his leman, and when he took up his residence in Oslo, he gave her a manor in the hundred of Bergheim. Of the children he had with her, only Lady Agnes grew up. When he was to marry the German princess, he took his base-born daughter into his own house, but sent her mother to the convent of Rheims. There she became a nun some years later. A pious and virtuous woman she had always been, and kind to the poor, but in the king's bodyguard they all thought she was ill-chosen to be a royal leman, being small and pale, modest and shy with strangers. It was said she had often begged her lord to show mercy to such as deserved severe punishment. Lady Agnes took after her mother. She was small and wan, without charm, hard to talk to, but a gentle lady. One day, as Olaf was sitting alone in the house, seeing to his weapons, a woman came in and went along the beds, lifting the coverlets and feeling the pillows. When she came into the light, Olaf saw that it was Lady Agnes herself. He stood up and bowed, and when she came and gave him her hand, he dropped on one knee before the king's daughter and kissed her hand, thinking the while that she was more like a worn-out cottar's wife who was forced to keep up her toil until the very hour when she would be brought to bed. I wish to see if our guests are honourably housed here," said Lady Agnes. She sank upon a stool, and Olaf stood before her with bowed head and a hand upon his breast. He thanked her. They lived well here in every way. "You men from the Oslo fjords can know but little of how it has fared with your homes," the lady asked. "No," said Olaf. "They had heard no news from thence since they took the field." "Then you have not had a joyful Yule?" Olaf could not help laughing a little. He had never drunk so good a Yule, he answered. "But you don't know whether your manor is standing or whether it lies in ashes." "Hestviken has thrice lain in ashes, my lady," replied Olaf as before. "If it is burnt now for the fourth time, then I must even do as my fathers, take such fortune as God sends me, and build it up again." "And what of your kinsfolk?" asked Lady Agnes. "My son is with Ranvold on the border, and my daughters are with friends on the west side of the fjord, so I don't need to distress myself for them." "Then you have no wife alive?" "No, lady. This is the 8th winter since she died." "Ah, then it must be easier for you, Olaf, than for many men. One hears so many tales. The poor country folk in the south, God help them." "Amen to that, lady. But if he will, they will not have long to wait either, ere they be helped and avenged. Ill it is that we have not your lord with us, but Ivar has good will enough."
"Oh, I don't know," the lady sighed. "I cannot say I grieve so sorely either that Hafthor is away. Yeomen against German mercenaries, it is an unequal struggle, even though the yeomen have numbers. And yet it is sad for me that my lord is absent from me at this time."
Olaf looked down at the little wife. He thought her condescension somewhat uncalled for, and her words ill-suited to a king's daughter. But he felt sorry for her. She had fine brown eyes like those of a hind, but other beauty there was none in her. Nevertheless, it was with a strangely keen pity that he heard, one morning a few days later, that now Lady Agnes lay in the pains of childbirth, and the ladies who were about her didn't know how it might fare with her. John and his kinsman wandered about with gloomy looks, but what they must chiefly have feared was that, if Lady Agnes should die, the strongest tie would be broken which bound Hafthor Johnson to the king, and if the child were lost, it would be one less arrow in their quiver. But in the course of the evening a message came that Lady Agnes had been delivered of a fine big son, and then there was joy. John ordered in mead and wine, and the men drank to the welfare of the newborn babe. The grandfather had the elder boy, the year-old John, brought in, whom his kinsmen called the Junker among themselves. He was hailed and passed from man to man, and the Franklins drank till they were under the table, like men, as Ivar said. Next day the newborn son was christened by Sire Halbjorn. Magnus he was called. The guests at the manor joined the kinfolk with their offering, and in the evening they held the christening ale with great merriment. But Olaf could not but think of the young mother, whom everyone seemed to forget. One of her ladies had said she was very sick, lay wandering in a fever and wailing that Sire Hafthor did not come into her. They could not make her understand that he was in Bjorgvin. But 2 days before St. Hilary's Day, there came word in the evening to Suderheim that a levy of over 2,000 men from Lear and Ringerike was marching on Oslo. The state of affairs in the town was that Duke Eirik had been dangerously ill during the holy days, but now he was better, and for joy of that his friends would keep the last day of Yule with wassailing. The men of Lear had had news of this, and they thought to fall upon the town that night. Ivar Johnson and his friends held a council at once, and next morning they set out with a body of over 300 men, but the rest of the realm Rakings, who dwelt farther to the north and west, were to follow as quickly as they could. Ivar was afraid the men of Lear might forestall him and reap all the glory. The men from Oslo fjord now mustered about 50, and Olav Audunsson was their leader. It was he who raised the yeomen for the first attack on the Swedes, and it was he who had sent warning betimes to the captain of Akershus. He himself had thought nothing of this till now, nor had he been among the leaders in the fight on the Oslo road. But here at Suderheim he won credit for it, and it seemed to come about of itself that he was held to be the man of greatest mark among his company, the master of the ancient chieftain's seat of Hestviken, and Alf Erlingson's liegeman in days gone by. And here he himself thought it natural, as it should be, but beyond that it concerned him no more. The other 3 subordinate chiefs were much younger men, nearer in age to Ivar Johnson. As it was falling dark, they reached the village of Veit below the Gellir ridge, and here they learnt that the Duke had set out guards at Hofvin Spittal, at Sinsen and at Acre by the church. but only a few men at each place, for it happened luckily that all these houses on the high roads belonged to Nonnesæter, and the abbess, Lady Groa Guttormsdatter, had protested with heavy threats against any injury being done to her dependents. Nor would the Duke care to break peace with the masculine nun more than there was need. Everywhere in the ravaged districts the sisters' tenants had been let off more lightly than other farmers, whether owners or tenants. Those who held their land of the crown or of the nobles had fared worst. Sire Halbjorn laughed when he heard it. There was no love lost between him and the Lady Abbess, for she had disputes of his own with her, but he too saw the humour of this. The priest accompanied Ivar in arms and armour. After consultation with some of those who lived in the neighbourhood, it was decided that the Realmreekings should move up into the forest before daybreak and conceal themselves there till the next evening. Then they would advance along the river Alna, surprise the guards at Höfvin on the way, and fall upon the town above Markstokke, at the same time as the men of Lear entered it from the west, by way of the convent of nuns. The latter body would have to pass round by Acre Church, and over Fristjar Bridge, as the ice on the Bjarvik was unsafe, and the lower reach of the Fristjar was not yet frozen over. Up here on the high ground it had frozen a little, and there was enough snow to enable the messengers sent westward by Ivar Johnson to use their skis, if they kept to the roads and fields. They settled themselves in the farms at Feet, Ivar and his captains, intending to rest there till daylight. But shortly before midnight the door of the house was suddenly flung open, and in came one of the farmers with whom they had spoken earlier in the evening, accompanied by an old woman, his mother. She lived in the town with her married daughter, and they kept an alehouse in a yard near the palace. The Duke's men had had word that a strong body of country levies was marching on Oslo from the west, and therefore they were making ready to attempt the storming of Akershus Castle in the morning. The woman had watched for her chance of slipping out of the town and bringing the message, for in Oslo it was whispered among the townsmen that the lords of Suderheim were also engaged in raising men from the uplands, but the Swedes believed nothing of this. "There will be another dance, then, for the last day of Yule," said Sire Halbjorn. Now it was hard to know what course the Realmreikings should follow. Then Sire Halbjorn demanded a hearing, and said there were no more than 2 counsels to choose between, and neither is of the best. One is that we set off at once and go west, the same way that our messengers went. Cross the river by Sandakra, fall upon the guards at Acre Farm, and then we must hold Frisia Bridge tomorrow until the men from Lear come up, if we can. Should the Duke have the luck to take Akershus, he can prepare a bloody bath for the yeoman's army coming from the west, and buy his peace with King Hakon at whatever price he himself may offer, he and his Norse friends. The other counsel is that we turn for home again, up to Raumarik, and wash down our shame with the last of the Yule barrels at Suderheim. Young Ivar and his captains discussed the priest's counsel. It would be fighting on unequal terms, 300 men, and of those not more than 47 mounted and armed after the manner of horsemen, the rest yeomen on foot, against the Duke's mercenaries and well-trained men-at-arms. "What do you say, Olav Audunsson?" asked Ivar. "You are the oldest and most experienced." "I say the priest is right. There are but 2 courses open. Neither is good. But the first plan doesn't seem to me so bad after all. If we cannot hold the bridge, we can break it down and take refuge in Akershus." Sire Halbjorn reminded them that it was of great moment to prevent the Duke getting possession of the castle. They must make ready to break down the bridge, as Olaf said. And they had the church of Acre and the churchyard in their rear. That was a good position to defend. If the enemy got part of his men across, and if they were driven back from the churchyard, they would have to take refuge in the church. That they could hold till the army from the west came up. "Do you yourself believe what you said?" asked Olav as he and the priest were arming. "That the men from Lear can cut their way through to the church if the mounted troops reach the heights west of the Frisia?" Sire Halbjorn shook his head. "But we cannot return home without having ventured a brush, and it may cost the country dear if Duke Eirik is to hold Akershus and treat for peace with his father-in-law that was to be." "No, you are right. I think this business has been somewhat brainlessly undertaken. But Ivar is young. It is worse to be heartless than brainless, and the heart is good enough both in him and the men. No lack of fighting spirit." "No. Do you remember last summer at the wedding when your axe sang? Now we shall soon see whether the warning was for you or for me. I have never heard that such weapons rang save for their own kin. But as things are shaping up here, it looks most likely that it may mean both of us," said Olaf with a little laugh. And Sire Halbjorn laughed too. "Ah, yes, it does look that way indeed." There was no moon, and the sky was strewn with stars. The snow was not deep enough to hinder the advance seriously, and now it was freezing a little. Olav Audunsson and Sire Halbjorn rode at the head of the Oslo fjord troop. It was the last in the line. Olaf and the priest had borrowed horses from Suderheim, but Olaf said he would fight on foot, for he was more used to that. "If this frost hold a few days," said the priest, "the Duke will be able to bring mail-clad horsemen across Bjarvik." "Ah, yes, we are late in moving," said Olaf, "and lucky if we are not too late." At Suderheim they would stay for the christening ale. And be sure, these men from the west have had weddings and funerals and Yule barrels that must be emptied. But maybe we can yet drive back the Duke, as a repentant sinner drives off the devil at his last gasp. Olaf said nothing. He looked before him where the host of constellations descended to the dark line of the wooded ridge. It was strange to think he should have suffered so much all these years on account of one dead man, pondered so sadly upon death and all that came after, but when it came to war and fighting, all such thoughts flew away and were as nothing. And so, no doubt it is always and for every man. Their guide could not find the ford over the river where the advanced guard had crossed. They had to go right up to a kind of pool where boats lay. This delayed the Oslo fjord troop so much that it was already growing light as they came down again by the path that ran through the alder brakes on the right bank. The sky stretched above them wide and light, yellow as sulphur down toward the eastern hills as they sighted the tower of Aker Church above the trees, and below them on the farther side of the Frisia they saw the roofs of fors white with snow against the white ground. At the head of the fjord a mist lay over Akershus and the town, spread out in a thin sheet, above which rose the towers of Hallvard's church and the gables of the old royal castle. It looked more hopeful at the bridge than Olaf had imagined. He had not passed this way since the king had built wooden towers at the bridgeheads. They were bigger than he had thought. The eastern one, on the Oslo side, was so much lower that the men on the western tower could shoot over it at an army advancing against Akersness from the east. Nor had Ivar been idle. His men were engaged in hoisting up stones and missiles into the barbicans, and in the middle of the bridge, where it rose highest, they were building a breastwork. Some men were pulling down a few small cottages near the bridge, dragging out the logs and doors, while others loaded sleds with stones on the hillside, and others again drove them down. So the men of the Oslo fjord found work to do at once. From the Raumreikings they learnt that the guards at Acre Farm had been overpowered, cut down or made prisoner. Sara Halbjorn at once secured 2 of the crossbows that Ivar had taken from the Swedes, for himself and Olav Audunsson. They both shot just as well with these weapons as with the longbow. The day was already so far advanced that the Norwegians were saying that either the widow at Veit had been doting or the Swedes had given up the attack on the castle. The southwestern sky was already afire above the forest on the Eikeberg ridge. The sun was just rising when they heard the muffled beat of kettle drums just below at the brow of the wood under Fors. Their own work had been so noisy and the falling water roared so under the bridge that they had not heard the sound of advancing troops before. Now the rumble of many hoofs and the clanging of mail-clad men and horses rose and rolled toward them together with the undertone of drums. The yeoman had been seen. A storming ladder swung up above the bushes and shot down again. They were trying whether it worked in the grooves. Olav flung his shield onto his back and dashed across the bridge with 14 others, climbing over the obstacle in the middle. He had offered to take his stand in the foremost tower, and had picked his party of young, strong lads who had a brisk look to his thinking. A boy came with them, bearing a banner. Olav knew his face from the streets of Oslo, but didn't know who he was or how he had come here. And Olav answered, laughing, yeah, let them set it up." It was a yellow banner with an image of St. Olav on it. They had taken it out of the church. No doubt it belonged to a guild in Oslo. The sun's disk shone in splendour over the top of the ridge as he stood on the flat roof of the Barbican and saw and heard the enemy breaking out of the brushwood beyond the fields. The long mail-clad ranks advancing with a faint jingling and a subdued glitter in the cold shadows upon the white ground, the bright patches of the banners, the scaling ladders and battering rams that they carried. And now a horn rang out, and short cries were heard. Olaf felt his heart beat fast. It was a hostile troop, but no matter. His joy at the sight ran down him like a deep draught of cold, strong ale. He cried the watchword, at the same moment raising his shield aslant without thinking. Old habits revived of themselves in every joint of his body. Simultaneously with the whirring of the 2 small catapults he had on his tower came the first shower of arrows and bolts from the western tower over their heads. The men on the eastern Barbican crouched down with their shields over their heads and looked through the loopholes. Some horses had fallen, breaking the ranks and causing confusion. "Do they have only 4 ladders?" cried Olaf to his neighbour, the boy from Oslo. "They lost some under Akersness." A volley from the hostile army came flying, striking the wall of the Barbican, rattling on the bridge behind them. But only a few shots fell on the roof, and none took effect. With exultant cheers the Norwegians picked them up. Now the ground thundered with heavily armoured horses. A troop of them were trotting toward the gate. They bore an iron-shod pole among them. "What kind of playthings are these that they use? Do they think to take Akershus with the like of that? You know they cannot bring their great battering rams by this road," the Oslo boy roared back. "Across the hill. They have reckoned on the frost. Then they have been almost as bullheaded as our Ivar." They shot the Swedes' own bolts back at the troop. They fell harmless on their good defensive armour, and raised the cauldron of boiling water up to the top of the parapet. As the first blow of the ram crashed against the gate, making the whole tower shake, the Norwegians emptied the cauldron upon the men below. The shrieks of scalded men and horses, the thud of hooves and the jingling of armour were drowned almost at once in the din of a fresh troop which came up and thrust aside the sprawling mass of the first. "Go slow," shouted Olaf to his men. "Reserve your stones." They had not too many of them and had to try to shoot straight down so as to prevent the attackers as long as possible from taking up the ram which their comrades had dropped when the water came down on them. Meanwhile, bolts and arrows from the archers in front rained down on their shields, and from the rear the shots of the Roundbreakings in the western tower flew over their heads. Olaf saw one horseman who had been pressed too far out to the right. His horse slipped under him. Brought down on its haunches, it slid down the river bank. Its shrill neighing rose above the din and roar of the waterfall as it was carried into the dark, rushing water, with its rider hanging in the stirrup. The steep bank was covered with ice underneath the snow on both sides of the foot of the tower, and this was of great assistance to the Norwegians. The enemy could not send so many men at a time against the gate, and so far they had not succeeded in bringing up ladders. But it could not be long delayed. A shout reached him from the bridge. 8 or 9 men were lifting baskets of stones over the breastwork and dragging them along. It had occurred to Ivar Johnson that missiles might soon run short in the foremost barbican. Thoughtless, the young man was not. Olaf's heart laughed with joy within him. Ivar had withdrawn his men from the breastwork, stood waiting with them in the western barbican, and this was right. It could not be very long before the Swedes broke down the eastern gate and reached the bridge. Ivar had had the parapet of the bridge thrown down at each end of the obstacle. They had just had time to hoist up the baskets of stones when the first scaling ladder fell against the parapet. So now it was the turn of the axes. It was a good thing he had brought up the basket-bearers, thought Olaf. Otherwise he would have been short of men for this work. Man after man they hurled down as they swarmed up the ladders. 1 or 2 of his own lay low, and the boards of the floor were bloody. But so was the snow at the foot of the tower, what snow there was left. They could not hold the tower for long. Olaf glanced up at the sun. The fight had scarcely lasted half an hour. Now the gate gave way beneath them with a crash, and it felt as if the whole tower staggered. Olaf ran to the other side and looked down to see how things were going. The yeomen had dashed forward and manned the breastwork, Ivar in the midst of them. The horsemen could only advance 2 abreast. The blows of the yeomen's maces and axes and the clash of swords rose above cries and the tramping of horses. For a while this might go well. More of the mounted troop, horse and man together, had gone down in the torrent. Now the Swedes were sending footmen onto the bridge. Sara Halbjorn he saw on the top of the breastwork, slashing with his great 2-handed sword. The priest fought like a devil. Olaf threw away the fragments of his shield. There were only splinters left between the iron bands. He grasped Kinfetch in both hands and turned to where the ladder had been. But now it was gone. It hung on a jutting rock in the hollow sheet of ice over the torrent, and they were bringing up another. Behind him his men thrust down the enemies who were trying to mount the inside ladder to the roof. They ought to have drawn it up. Now Ivar and his men sprang over the breastwork and advanced over the bridge. They cleared it in a moment, for that time, and the Swedes drew back across the fields out of bowshot. Olaf lifted off his helmet to cool himself a moment. There was refreshment, too, in the stillness, with the roar of the torrent which had been drowned by the fighting. And now he found it was not only sweat that had made his clothes stick to him, for his elk's hide hauberk was slit just above the body plate, and it was bloody, but the scratch he had gotten was not a deep one, by the way it felt. A morion appeared in the opening. Sara Halbjorn was climbing up the ladder. "How many of you are alive? Go back now, you, and we fresh men will receive the next shock." "There is not much here to receive a shock with, Sara Halbjorn." They saw men coming across the fields from the houses of fours. They were carrying something. "They will try to set fire to the barbican," said Olaf. "We must hold out as long as we can." "Ivar has placed combustibles within the breastwork," said the priest. "Then it will end in the bridge being burnt. After that they can stand on either bank and sing staves against one another," laughed Olav. "And then the issue will be better than we had looked for." In the fields in front the horns sounded the assembly. Olav stooped and picked up the yellow Olaf banner which had been torn down and set it up again. It was now stained with blood. "Now we must show them what we can do with a crossbow," Sigrid Undset. The horsemen came on in close array, and in their rear followed men with fire cauldrons, pots of pitch and faggots. A bolt from Sigrid Undset's bow was so truly aimed that one of the fire pots dropped on the ground and turned over. Ivar Johnson and his men had propped up the doors and wreckage in the gateway. They stood behind with long spears, clubs and cudgels with scythe blades, and in their rear the bridge was filled with men waiting to go forward as those in the front rank fell. The third attack thundered against the gate and the shaking walls of the barbican. Once more Ivar Johnson and his yeomen succeeded in beating back the assault, and the sullen little fire that smouldered at the base of the tower was put out by the men on the roof with a cauldron of water from the cold fireplace in the tower. No one had managed to keep the fire in. Again the Swedes withdrew a little way, and the noise died down. From the barbican they could see the leaders ride around the ranks and come together for a consultation. And all at once the priest cried, "Look!" Olaf turned and looked where the other pointed. "Ah, now we can make an end and sing Nunc Dimittis," said Sigrid Undset. Teams of horses broke through the copsewood yonder. They drew the great catapults and heavy siege engines. Ivar Johnson ordered the horn to be blown. He stood on the bridge and called up to the men on the barbicans. His silken surcoat hung in strips outside his harness. They could do no more now but retire and see if they could break down the bridge after them. Then came the sound of a horn from the hill behind them, in notes that answered Ivar's. A bright resonant ribbon unwound itself in the blue and white light of the winter day. Olaf turned round. Up behind the churchyard fence, the morning sun flashed upon a close array of spear points. The shouts of joy from the little force about the bridge were met by a fresh blast of the horns. This was an ancient call. Folk named it the Andvakastrain, or King Sverre's dance. Little as Olav Audunsson was minded to praise old King Sverre, there was yet no tune he would so gladly have heard in this hour. Sigrid Undset had laid hold of Olaf's arm. The priest's hand was bloody. Olaf saw with surprise that the other's cheeks were ashy white. His face was distorted in a wild luxury of pain. "That is our horn. My father's, I mean. I should know it above all others. Then they must be here, my brothers, Finn or Eystein." And as the horn sounded anew the Andvakastrain, Sigrid Undset joined in, singing in his fine and powerful voice the ancient stave that went to that tune. "Cattle die, kinsmen die, last dies the man himself. One thing I know that never dies, the fame of each man dead." They took it up and sang with him, all those who knew the stave, while the Raumreikings tore down the obstacle before the first mounted troop. There were at any rate 50 men on horseback, armed after the fashion of the king's men. They rode across the bridge, and after them swarmed the footmen, country folk, but most of them handsomely armed. Olaf saw Sigrid Undset running out into the fields by the side of a high brown horse, holding on to the saddle-bow. The man who rode it wore a closed helm and a fluttering blue silken surcoat over his armour. What the newcomers meant to do, Olaf could not rightly guess. It looked as if they would try to drive back the enemy in open fight out in the fields. They had already surrounded the body of Swedes who were on their way to the bridge, and with the knights who led them at their head, the men from the west were now advancing far off against the main body who stood by the siege engines at the brow of the wood. Ivar Johnson had mounted the barbican with Marcus of Loughton, one of his captains. "Can they do that? Drive back the German mercenaries with a rabble of peasants? Then anything may happen." "There must be 2,000 of them at least," said Olaf. They continued to pour down the hill below the church and across the bridge. "And not 1 in 20 can get back over the bridge if they are beaten," said Marcus. The attack of the Norwegian knights had already broken down. 2 of them were dragged from their horses and carried away as prisoners. But the Lidungs simply went on. If one body was thrown back, another troop dashed forward. Time after time the German mercenaries rode into the mass, trampled them down and used their lances. But the Norwegians ran in upon them from the other side, hammering at men and horses with clubs and axes, cutting and thrusting with hafted scythe blades and spears. They had pressed up to the edge of the wood in great numbers, and managed to hold the enemy there, so that his catapults were of little use against them. But neither could the men in the barbicans support the Lidungs to any extent. They were fighting out of bowshot. Before the bridge all was quiet. A few horses and men lay stretched in the brown and bloody slush, and one of the horses moved and struck out with his hoofs now and again. A young lad came walking toward the bridge, supporting his right arm, from which the blood dripped in his left, and he jogged homeward with a curiously peaceful, solitary air, as though he were carrying something he had been out to buy. But now the first groups of yeomen were being driven back over the lands of Fors. Olaf grasped his crossbow. As he put his foot in the stirrup and drew it, he noticed for the first time that his body was stiff with tiredness. Once more the flying Lidungs rallied in the fields, and once more the enemy rode forward. At that moment something struck Olaf on the right cheekpiece of his helmet. There was a crash inside his head, and he fell backward into Ivar's arms. For a moment everything went round and round. When he stood up again and took his bow, he felt his mouth full of blood and pulpy flesh. He spat out blood and splinters of teeth, and shot again with his crossbow. Now the Lidungs had retreated so far that the Swedes could reach them with their catapults. Stones and other missiles fell among the knots of men, and the first fugitives began to make, some for the bridge, others for the forest to the northward. Olaf had stopped using his bow. He stood gazing intently at the conclusion of the fight, while all the time, without thinking, he had to feel with his tongue the sharp edge of steel which had penetrated his cheek, and the broken molar in his upper jaw. But soon his tongue grew stiff and swollen, and the wound filled his whole mouth like a bloody sponge. But he gave little attention to it as he watched the fighting draw to its end. The horn of the Valdres knights sounded the assembly untiringly, and once more the main body of the western men formed up just below the barbican. The Realmreikings in the towers had now been relieved by fresh men with bags and quivers full of bolts and stones. Olaf tried to speak to those who had come up and stood around him, but his speech was no more than a croaking in the throat, with all the blood and spittle that filled his mouth. He could scarcely believe his eyes, but the Swedes were not advancing. It looked as though they were about to retire into the woods. Had they had enough of the game? A while after he walked back across the bridge, as in a dream, so heavy was his head, amid the stream of strangers who were returning. But he had bethought him of his axe before going down from the tower. As in a dream, he remembered striding over dead bodies that lay inside the barbican at the bottom of the ladder, and as in a dream he heard the shouts of the men who manned the towers, making ready to defend them again, if there were need. He had to make way for 2 men who were carrying a third by the shoulders and knees. Drowsily he noticed that the planks of the bridge were dark and slippery with blood, and he turned a little giddy at the sight of the black water that rushed under the bridge and thundered over the fall. When he had come a little way up the hill toward Acre Church, he stopped and laid down his axe. He wanted to take off the helmet which pressed so painfully on his head, and it was horrible with this splintered steel among the torn and tender flesh of his mouth. A man stopped and helped him with it. The sweat burst out anew all over his sweat-drenched body, and the tears came into his eyes before the other had got the helmet off him, and his cheek was gashed worse than before. The stranger offered to take him under his arm, but Olaf shook his head and tried to laugh, but could not, for his face had grown so stiff and seemed enormous. Then the other picked up the axe and the helmet and gave them to him, said something with a laugh, and went on. Olaf tried to wipe away some of the blood that trickled down his neck. It made him so disgustingly wet underneath his clothes. The sun was now high in the heavens, he noticed. It was past midday, and had turned to the clearest and finest of winter days. The tree-tops round the church shone against the blue sky as though it was springtime, but the light hurt his eyes. He came up to a farm on the hill and went into one of the houses. It was packed full of men, but he saw no one he knew. Several spoke to him when they saw his shattered face, but he could not get out a word. Some of them made room so that he could sit on the floor in front of a bench, and one who sat on the bench took his head in his lap, and then weariness overcame him. He did not really sleep, for the pains in his head increased, as though tearing out his very skull, and he felt himself growing chilled and numb, but he sank into a sort of lethargy. Once he was roused from it. A bulky elderly woman had hold of him. A half-grown girl with solemn staring eyes stood by, holding a bowl from which steam rose, and the woman dipped a towel that was now stained brown and washed the blood from his face and neck with lukewarm water. Dizzy and impatient with fatigue and pain, he had to submit to be helped up so that he could sit on the bench, gazing the while with longing at the great blaze on the hearth, for he was shivering. The woman and a man stripped away his elk-skin hauberk, peeled off his jerkin and shirt, which stuck fast to the skin. Naked to the waist, he sat shivering as they washed him and tended his wound, a cut reaching upward to below the left nipple, and then they drew on his clothes again, which were now soaking wet. He staggered to his feet and tried to go and sit by the fire, but a woman who was like Torhild took him by the arm and led him to a bed which had been made on the floor. When once he had laid down, it was good indeed to stretch out his limbs and lean his back and neck against the big sacks of hay. She who looked like Torhild spread a thin coverlet over him and offered him a warm drink, but he could not take much into his mouth, and it was too painful to swallow. But soon he felt the warmth of the rug and of a big black-bearded man against whom he was lying, and the warmth was an unspeakable relief, although his head felt as if it would burst with pain. After a while he was again roused from his doze. They wanted him to go out with them. He went. It was almost dark outside, the southern sky a greenish yellow. Great white stars were shining in the frosty evening. Up by the church, great red bonfires were burning, around which moved black figures. The stables and the church barn were crowded with men. The main door of the church stood wide open, and he saw that many candles were lighted in the choir. A flood of song welled out, but his companion led him past to a group of houses. He came into a room where many men were assembled. He recognized Ivar Johnson and one or two from home. Some of them were busy about a bench, and on it lay a naked corpse which they were washing. Olaf stepped up and saw that it was Sigrid Undset. He lay upon his back, long and white, with his arms hanging down so that the hands rested on the clay floor with the palms upward. The left arm was broken so that the bones protruded above the elbow. They were just washing the blood out of his grizzled red hair, and there was a faint crackling of broken bone. The skull had been shattered above the left temple. Beside the bench stood a bucket of steaming red water. Ivar Johnson came up to Olaf. He told him in a whisper that they had found the priest's body in a thicket of briars, close up to where the Swedes' catapults had been posted. Half naked and plundered. His arms were missing, as was his seal ring, and the gilt Agnus Dei that Olaf remembered Sigrid Undset always wore about his neck. His brother, the knight Finn Erlingsson, was among those the Swedes had taken prisoner. But his sons, Eindrid and Erling, were here, Ivar went on to tell him. Olaf looked at the two slight red-haired lads who stood by their uncle's body and nodded. Ivar was still talking. There had been Lidungs, Ringer Rikings and men from Modheim parish among the levies, and a little band from Valdres led by Sir Finn. The dead man's face was grey and calm as a stone image. The men who stood by were discussing what the scars could be that the priest carried on his body. The left shoulder and upper arm was scored as though the flesh had been torn, and on the left pectoral muscle were 4 deep little pits. From there a silver-white furrow ran down across the stomach. But the scars were old, so it was hard to say what kind of wild beast he had been at grips with. Olaf knelt down together with some others, but his wound and his whole head ached so that he could say no prayer. When he rose to his feet, they had dressed the corpse and moved it to the bier. Now Sigrid Undset lay like a priest, dressed in an alb and an old chasuble, with sandals on his feet and a pewter chalice between his clasped hands. Some of the priests of Acre Church had provided what was fitting for their dead brother. Olaf accompanied the bier as it was carried down to the church. Several other biers were already standing before the chancel arch. But he had not the strength to stay and hear the vigil. The man who had accompanied him to the mortuary chamber took him under the arm and led him back to the farm where he had found shelter. It was Little Acre, the other told him. Bodily pain was a wholly new experience for Olav Audunsson. Wounds and scratches he had known many a time, with smarting and fever, but they had always been such as he counted for nothing, flesh wounds which healed rapidly and cleanly. But this wound in his face was downright torture, a racking and shooting pain in his skull, and an intolerable aching in the jawbone and in the root of the broken tooth. But worst of all was the loathsomeness of it. His mouth was always filled with the foul taste of matter from the wound. Now and again he had high fever, and then it was as if the bed he lay in rose up, and his body felt flat as an empty bladder, while something round and heavy which had been inside his head rolled down over him. And visions hovered along the ridge of his brows, creatures that were neither beast nor man, faces he recognised without knowing who they were. In particular there was a beggar without feet, who darted along at a terrible pace on boards fixed to his hands and knees. It tormented him more than anything when that vision came. One night he saw Ingunn. She stood a little off the ground against the wall at the foot of his bed and leaned forward over him, so that her light brown hair swept over her thin bare arms and fell forward like a mantle. He thought she was clad in nothing but a shift, which was embroidered at the neck with little green flowers, so that all the little coloured spots danced before his eyes. Olaf raised his hands to keep her from coming nearer, for just in those days his wound was angry and stank foully. but she sank down upon him like a wave of warmth and sweetness. He was flooded, as it were, with the goodness of her. Then he lost his senses and fell into a kind of swoon. In the morning he was able to spit out a whole mass of matter and splinters that had worked out of his jaw. The woman who tended him could wash the wound fairly clean, and he felt better. He was weak and cold, and as he could only lie on the left side, it felt as if the bones were coming through the flesh there, so tender was it. At the same time he was famished. He had hardly been able to swallow anything of what they brought and tried to make him drink. They had been to see him almost every day, one or another of his companions in arms, but he had not been fit to pay much attention to what they told him. But this morning came Ivar Johnson himself and some others. They could scarce conceal their exultation. The Duke had withdrawn from Oslo at daybreak. It was clear he had lost his relish for trying his teeth on the walls of the castle of Acre, sick as he was himself, and with 3,000 men of the country levies posted on the high ground. And Ingunn had received reinforcements, and was thought to have put the castle in excellent posture of defence. The Duke had not lost much above 100 men in the fight at Frisia Bridge. Of the yeomen, 200 had fallen, and many had gotten wounds, great and small. But it seemed Duke Eirik thought this might be enough. He had looked for no opposition at all, counting rather that the greater part of the Norwegian nobles would be so discontented with King Hakon that they would make common cause with him. After his friends had left him, Olaf lay feeling how his whole being was now permeated by the pent-up joy and confidence that had lain in the depths of his soul all these long days, while his body was one mass of pain and fetid humours and burning fever. In spite of all, this joy had lived within him the whole time, like a glow upon the hearth of a ruinous house. No pain could take from him the joy of having had the chance to stand up and act and fight for his home and his native soil against the strangers who poured over it. Even if it had availed nothing, that could not have undone the joy it gave him that they had risen in defence, he and his fellows in the countryside. But now that it had availed, he lay there feeling his tortured body as but a thin and passing scab upon sound, healing flesh. He was glad, deeply and cordially glad, as he had not been since he was young. During all his long years at home, while it seemed as if his life had so shaped itself that in other men's eyes he had nothing to complain of, did he not have prosperity, health and peace? It had been with him in secret, as though the snakes were striking and tearing at his heart, as in the image of Gunnar on the door of the closet at home. In his soul he had fought without hope, harried by a terrible dread, against powers that were not of flesh and blood. He saw now it was not his suffering that destroyed the happiness of his life. A man may be happier while he suffers than when his days are good. And sufferings that are of some avail, they are like the spear points that raise the shield on which the young king's son sits when his subjects do him homage. Some days later, Klaus Wiepart came with a sled. He proposed that Olav Audunsson should move down to his house and submit himself to his leechcraft. Olaf said yes to this. He could not, in any case, stay longer at Little Acre. Klaus tortured and plagued him sorely at first, wrenched out the stump of his tooth, picked out splinters of bone, cut and burnt at the wound. Olaf bore it all with patience. Nothing made any impression on this strange, quiet joy of having fought and seen that it was of use. Not the thought that Klaus would surely see to it that he was well paid for the cure, nor all that he heard of the Swedes harrying the countryside as they withdrew from the realm. He could get no word of how things were at Hestviken, whether the manor had been burnt, but this touched him so little. Had he had women and children at home, it would have been otherwise. The grass was green in Klaus Weipart's garden, and great yellow buds were bursting on the trees when at last Olaf could make ready for the homeward journey. The wound was now almost healed, and the skin had grown again on his cheek. The day before he was to leave, he asked Klaus's leman if she would lend him her mirror. He sat with it a while, breathed on the bright disk of brass, wiped it, and looked again at his own face. His light hair had turned all grey. Its curls were lank and lifeless, and his square, clean-cut face was furrowed and faded. The right side was spoilt, the cheek so sunken that the whole face was awry, and the great red scar had an ugly look. The mouth was also drawn down a little on that side. In a way, Olav Audunsson had always been aware that he was an unusually handsome man. Not that it had made him vain, and in his youth it had annoyed him if anyone spoke of it, or if the women let him see that they would be glad to have dealings with him, because he was so bright and fair. In an obscure fashion he had felt that his physical grace was itself a part of the tie of flesh and blood which bound him to Ingunn, since he had not yet been fully grown when they were mated. But it had been an element in his knowledge of himself that he was, once for all, a well-favoured man, rather short than tall, but strong and faultlessly built, without an unhealthy spot in his whole close-knit, shapely frame. Fair and bright of hair and skin and eyes, as befitted the race from which he was sprung. It was something of a humiliation that now this was past and gone. But he took it patiently as a judgment that now he must think himself old. Nor was he so many years from the 500, so he must needs bow to it. And so he came home to Hestviken one fine spring, to green meadows and bursting leaves in the groves. The houses were standing, but all of them were empty. The Swedes had cut down and carried off all they found. In the byre stood a cow and a heifer, which Lady Marta had bought of Thorhild Bjornsdatter when she fetched home the children and the serving-maids. But Marta Birgersdatter was just as calm as was her wont, and Olaf was just as calm as she, and they sat and talked together in the evening. But Olaf said very little, for he spoke rather thickly from the wound in his mouth, and it shamed him to talk. He was glad that the children had been fetched. Thorhild Bjornsdatter was the only one he was loath should see him, now that he was thus marred.